one today. Four speakers will appear in it: Antony Kałasznikov, Andres Kurk, Julia Deszeper, and Barbara Dudasz. I see all the panelists are present and ready, so we can begin. I just remind that each panelist has 20 minutes. We will ask questions after all the papers. Antony Kałasznikov will speak first. He represents NRU Higher School of Economics and University of Alberta. His paper is entitled Totalitarian Heritage and Cultural Recycling, the Case of Stalinist Monuments. Antony, please. We can hear you.
Sorry about that. Can you hear me now? Excellent. And can you see my screen? Good. So the post-Soviet cityscape, it really abounds with Stalinist monuments, with imposing high-rises, resplendent metro station, expansive parks and exhibition grounds. And the totalitarian origins of Stalinist heritage are widely recognized, but contemporary publics nonetheless remain attracted to these objects. So in this presentation, I'd like to argue that the enduring appeal of Stalinist heritage is in part an outcome of their carefully calculated design as prospective monuments. That is, monuments that were built for the specific purpose of impressing future generations. And these monuments continue to shape the memory of the Stalinist era in important ways due to their enduring affective power and their inherent amnestic properties. So, as I mentioned, the Stalinist monument building program was explicitly predicated on the goal of immortalizing the memory of the era, увековечение памяти эпохи. And these monuments were constructed in durable materials, and they were consciously designed in a way that would make them understandable and appealing to posterity for years without end. Stalinist monuments were creations erected for the specific purpose of keeping single human deeds or events alive in the minds of future generations. That is, they were fundamentally prospective or future-oriented. Importantly, the Stalinist regime gravitated to the construction of architectural monuments over traditional standalone sculptures. So at the very first Congress of the Union of Soviet Architects in 1937, Politburo member Vlas Chubair exhorted architects to, quote, create great historical monuments which would show posterity the glory of our epoch. And this slogan was endlessly repeated throughout the time. Everything from canal systems to public buildings to exhibition grounds to subway systems were proclaimed monuments to the era, the stone pages of a monumental chronicle, a bequest to posterity, a contribution to the gold reserve of Soviet culture. And these monuments were designed to showcase the glorious events and individuals of the era. So the architectural canvas integrated recognizably Soviet ornamentation, memorial inscriptions, and various forms of monumental art like mosaic and sculptures. And they would all together commemorate the notable events and individuals of the Stalin era. The monument construction program was most developed in Moscow, which concentrated the symbolic functions of the country. In the subsequent discussion, I'll follow this focus on Moscow in discussing Stalinist monuments and their afterlife in the post-socialist cityscape. So Stalinist monuments have suffered only partial attrition in the successive waves of de-Stalinization. In the late 1950s, and early 1960s, visual representations and references to Stalin and his closest associates were quietly excised. Over 100 statues and decorative panels were removed from the Moscow metro alone. Yet while bereft of their references to the dictator, these monuments remained largely intact, and their arsenal of communist symbols and depictions of the key events of the era, they remained unchanged. So these architectural monuments still glorified the supposed triumphs of collectivization, force-paced industrialization, wartime victory, and the flowering of art and culture under Stalin's leadership. The fall of state socialist regimes catalyzed a second, more powerful wave of iconoclasm. Targets now included, in many cases, Soviet symbolism, representations of key events in Soviet history, and the remaining likenesses of communist leaders. Some Soviet symbolism was removed from public buildings, statues were toppled or relocated, and toponyms were replaced. But once again, Stalinist architectural monuments endured, and often with minimal alterations. Demolishing public buildings and efficient transportation systems is clearly impracticable. And so the built heritage of post-Soviet cities, and of Moscow especially, continues to bear the heavy imprint of the Stalinist period of socialist construction. And the situation appears to vindicate the predictions of Stalinist architects, like Alexei Shushev, for example. Once read, a book can easily languish in the library, whereas architectural monuments stand in the middle of the city and cannot be removed, remaining always a clear reflection of their epoch. But even while Stalinist monuments stand prominently in post-socialist cityscapes, researchers typically dismiss the possibility that they might carry out some of the memorial functions originally vested in them. After all, already in 1927, the writer Robert Musil famously quipped that there is nothing in this world as invisible as a monument. And Musil specifically caricatured monuments' visual irrelevance in an age of noise and movement. Others question the ability of memorials to outlast the narratives that give them meaning. Social theorist Anthony Giddens expresses dominant opinion in his claim that monuments turn into relics once formulaic truths are disputed or discarded. Nonetheless, I believe that there's presumptive evidence to suggest that Stalinist monuments have not only weathered iconoclastic campaigns physically, but they've also retained their visibility and enduring aesthetic appeal. And one way that they have done so is through sheer size. Stalinist architects expected that superior dimensions would secure the long-term visual dominance of their creations in the cityscape. So the massive size and central positioning of the 7 Stalinist high-rises in Moscow, for example, were expected to, I quote, subdue and unify the city and radically change its overall character. And this gamble on size and central positioning appears to have paid off. In Moscow, the 7 Stalinist high-rises continue to visually define the cityscape, and their role is in fact further accentuated by means of a nighttime lighting program. The gamble on grand historicist aesthetics has also seemingly paid off. Stalinist architects consciously selected the flowery neoclassical style as a supposedly timeless aesthetic language that would remain appealing and understandable to posterity. Art has a future only when it relies upon the past. This was a popular dictum of the time. That is, timeless, enduring laws of aesthetics could be derived from historical practice and then applied to designing these prospective monuments for the future. They were expected, this neoclassical language was expected to remain understandable and appealing for the coming centuries. And indeed, it seems like Stalinist aesthetics do retain their appeal to contemporary audiences. One 2009 survey, for example, testified to Muscovites' distinct preference for Stalin-era metro stations over those constructed in later periods. And Stalinist monuments also exude a strong magnetism. Witness the gratuitous descriptions of derelict metro stations in Dmitry Gluchovsky's post-apocalyptic novel Metro 2033, or the sort of hyper-Stalinist visualizations of the cityscape in Alexei Andrianov's blockbuster Spy, which came out in 2012. Property developers have also capitalized on associations of Stalinist buildings with quality and status. In Moscow, they've commissioned new developments in a sort of a neo-Stalinist style. And this includes metro stations like Park Pobedy, high-rises like Triumph Palace, Oruzheny, and the Alcon Tower development. It also includes residential buildings like Impersky Dom or Dostoyevsky. And importantly, as Olga Zinovieva notes, developers, I quote, not only turn to the style of Stalinist classicism, but they also advertise it, marketing their buildings in the terminology of the Stalin era, such as the 8th high-rise, the near dacha, and many others. So clearly then, Stalinist monuments are not invisible, and they remain strongly associated with the regime which sponsored their construction. But can it really be said that Stalinist architectural monuments continue to immortalize their era? Or are they recycled for other purposes? James Young believes that the original symbolism of a monument rarely survives. Neither the monument nor its meaning are truly everlasting. Both a monument and its significance are constructed in particular times and places, contingent on the political, historical, and aesthetic realities of the moment. And this has been the dominant way of analyzing the place of Stalinist monuments today. Scholars have noted that the revalorization of Stalinist architecture in Russia does not necessarily entail the wholesale revival of Stalinist historical narratives. Rather, these monuments have been commercialized, touristified, and drained of totalitarian meaning. Ostensibly, the public relates to these monuments in an entirely prosaic, apolitical, and non-symbolic fashion, seeing in them beautiful buildings, efficient means of transportation, and spacious recreation venues. But I think that the symbolic plasticity and passivity of Stalinist monuments should not be overstated. After all, along with these monuments, certain discourses and myths of the Stalinist period have also persisted. For example, many of the tropes of the Stalinist myth of the Great Patriotic War have endured in Russian memory culture. And specifically, this triumphal narrative emphasizes heroism, national unity, military prowess, while sidelining themes like collaborationism, war crimes, and incompetent political leadership. Because of this, Stalinist war monuments blend seamlessly into the Russian memorial landscape. They're carefully restored, and they continue to act as important commemorative sites. Their symbolic meaning resonates in today's context in much the same way as it did over the previous decades. And indeed, the entire built heritage of the Stalinist period, that is its architecture too, is sometimes interpreted as the legacy of a regime which saved the nation from destruction and led it to glorious victory. Some educators even suggest integrating the study of Stalinist architecture into the school curriculum for the spiritual and military patriotic edification of Russian youth. Stalinist monuments also figure as testaments to national greatness, both in and of themselves and through the achievements that they memorialize. In cultural diplomacy, Stalinist monumentalism increasingly serves as Russia's architectural calling card, and this has been an idea put forward by Maria Engström. For instance, Russia's grand historical narrative, choreographed for the televised opening ceremonies of the 2014 Winter Olympics, they profiled Shusev's Komsomolskaya Koltsevaya metro station, Vera Mukhina's worker and kolkhoz woman sculpture, as well as the Stalinist high-rises, as you can see on the image here. And the Olympic Gorod Gorky ski resort was constructed in an unabashedly neo-Stalinist style. At another international venue, the Venice Architectural Biennale in 2016, the Russian pavilion was devoted to the restoration and reconstruction of the Stalinist State Exhibition Complex, or the VDNH. And in large part, this ongoing state-supported project aims at recreating the exhibition ground's original Stalinist appearance by demolishing the pavilions and facades of later periods. Such nationalist and statist interpretations at least partially adhere to the original objectives of Stalinist architectural monuments, to memorialize the period as a time of national rebirth under strong state guidance. These monuments are read through contemporary lenses, to be sure, and they are recycled. But today's dominant discourses often exhibit continuity with Stalin-era narratives, allowing these monuments to be interpreted in ways similar to the ones envisioned by their original creators. Further, aside from immortalizing their proper subjects, Stalinist monuments operate as instruments of amnesia. The fact that Stalinist monuments were selected to outlast the centuries, whereas other elements of the built heritage were condemned to transience, this creates a fundamental disbalance in the built environment with far-reaching effects. As Valery Lazarev observes, for example, it's easy to misjudge the Gulag's contribution because its more lasting monuments, the Moscow Metro, Moscow University, are what remain. Forgotten are the roads to nowhere, long fallen into decay. And this dynamic is especially powerful given the rising salience of physical heritage over abstract historical narratives. As Sergei Ushakin observes, for those without personal experience of Soviet socialism, objects offer a form of affective experience. Thus, the tactility, the physicality of Stalinist monuments may trump the abstract, narrative-based history of Stalinist crimes. One study of Russian youth attitudes revealed that while young people recognize the tragedy of the Stalinist repressions, they nonetheless hold that at least Moscow has the best metro system in the world. And this seems to vindicate the perspective of Stalinist architects and other art professionals of the time. For instance, as Vera Mukhina stated in the 1940s, or rather predicted, the contemporary life of our people, its suffering and great victories, will be transmitted to posterity primarily through works of art. No scientific or official documents will transmit the spirit of our times as colorfully as artwork. And experience seems to bear this out. Stalinist monuments are emotionally resonant objects actively shaping the contemporary memory of the Stalin era, much as their creators had intended. Counteracting the significant mnemonic effects of Stalinist monuments requires a concerted effort at exposing their fundamentally mendacious and amnestic character. And I'm not going to recommend specific strategies for dealing with Stalinist heritage, but I think what can be established at this point is the marked inadequacy of leaving Stalinist monuments to their own devices to stand prominently in their status as protected heritage monuments. And yet this situation appears to largely be the case in Moscow, Stalinism's symbolic heartland and the focus of the regime's monument building program. These monuments are protected, but they are hardly ever contextualized or framed as historical objects. Museums can be effective in contextualizing Stalinist monuments, but there's a notable dearth of exhibits and displays. The chronological coverage of the Museum of Moscow ends in the Petrin era. Despite its namesake, neither does the Shushev Architectural Museum have a permanent exhibition on the Stalin period. And the state exhibition grounds, the VDNH, have not the smallest display devoted to their history. The Moscow Metro Professional Center does host a small exhibit on the history of the Moscow subway, but it takes a rather superficial approach. Rather than explore its problematic origins, the exhibition capitalizes on the retro appeal of Stalinist propaganda posters and photographs, which are reproduced in a vast collage that runs along the perimeter of the exhibition hall. Explanatory plaques and information can also, in theory, be affixed to monuments to reframe them as historical objects. And the Uznai Moskvu initiative goes some way towards this. This is a collaborative project between the municipality's departments of education, culture, heritage, and IT. And it's basically an interactive mobile app that enables the public to get detailed information about the city's monuments by scanning QR codes. However, the information blurbs that Uznai Moskvu provides, they're usually limited to describing the technical and formal features of the city's monuments. And this is usually in a neutral, but oftentimes in a sort of an exultant tone, which is presumably due to the touristic mission of the project. So for example, the text accompanying the Stalinist Ukraine hotel high-rise explains that for Russia, Stalinist classicism and Stalinist architecture have now become art, objects of national pride. Once again, reaffirming that sort of nationalist statist interpretation of these objects. So in a nutshell, Stalinist architectural monuments were built in order that posterity would remember their era, this era favorably. Thanks in part to their design, these objects have resisted destruction and decay, remaining visible and aesthetically pleasing. Often defying reinterpretation, they continue to support nationalist and statist discourses. Accordingly, these monuments demand a more concerted effort at reframing and contextualization.
Sorry, time is up. You have 2 minutes for finish, okay?
Yeah, I'm on my last point.
Okay.
They need to be recontextualized and reframed. And this promises to recover their problematic histories, counteract their immortalizing effects, and make manifest their intentional attempts to seduce us, the posterity for which these monuments were built. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Antony. And the author of the next paper is Andres Kurk from Institute of Art History, Estonian Academy of Art, who will talk about interventions in socialist architecture 1970 to 1980. Andres, please.
Okay, thank you very much. Do you hear me and see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, so thank you for this invitation, and thank you, Valeri, for organizing this very interesting conference. I will start right away because time is short. In May 1978, at an exhibition of young architects in the foyer of the Academy of Sciences Library in Tallinn, Estonian architect and artist Leonhard Lapin displayed his project, The City of the Living, the City of the Dead. The design inserted a cemetery into a public courtyard between existing prefabricated buildings of a kind that were typical of the residential districts constructed on the outskirts of Tallinn during the 1960s. The project proposed that garages be repurposed to function as tombs, with the cars inside acting as sarcophagi. That's the scene here below. and the gravestones serving also as the apparatus of a children's play area. In this way, people would take better care of the area, and parents would not allow their children to vandalize its equipment, mocked one reviewer of the show in a newspaper. This grotesque scene, executed in the style of pop art, satirized the idea of a new urban microdistrict that would provide everything necessary for daily life. Or as Lapin himself was later quoted as having said, that this added cemetery would make the district entirely self-sufficient, so that, I quote, inhabitants would be able to remain in their neighborhoods forever without ever needing to cross a single thoroughfare, unquote. The project referred to the courtyard visible from the living room window of the apartment in which Lapin lived at the time. In Lapin's design, several members of the architectural establishment had been buried in the courtyard. Their names are shown on the gravestones, and the corner of the courtyard has been set aside for the common grave of the Architects' Union. This is here. In this way, Lapin commented on the changed conditions of architects' work. In the context of mass-produced dwellings, the role of the architect had faded, leaving him or her only to follow obediently the many restrictive building law regulations. Although exceptional in the sharpness and directness of its critique, for the group of architects of which Lapin was a leading figure, this interest in the courtyards, unused territories between prefabricated houses, and reusing the residues of the modernization process was nothing new. For example, 2 years earlier, Lapin's colleague Tiit Kaljundi had presented a proposal called View of the New Visual Environment at an exhibition of monumental art in Tallinn Art Hall. In that work, Kaljundi imagined ways, this is the section I'm talking about, imagined ways to relieve the spatial inferiority of buildings, as he called it, and to insert landscape gardens between the prefabricated housing of the new districts. His proposals included the agrarian landscape in the courtyards, so that besides, and this is the agrarian landscape to be inserted in the courtyards, so that besides being visually attractive, they would provide inhabitants with an opportunity to observe the various stages of growth: sprouting, growing, maturing, and ripening. But another section of the same display here on the upper part showed a proposal to redevelop slag heaps in North Estonian mining areas as mountain skiing centers. Now, how then to understand these interventions that in different ways address the recently built housing areas? And what was their position vis-a-vis the official architectural doctrine? What were the adopted tactics in the critique and redefinition of the environment transformed by the industrialization and urbanization of the 20th century? I want to expand in what follows. I will examine first the works of an architectural group from Tallinn in the 70s and 80s that developed critical and conceptual projects diverging from the official doctrine and imagining alternatives to the rationalist organization of space. And then I will turn to a similar group of architects in Moscow in the 1980s who rose to prominence through their winning entries for the conceptual competition for international architecture journals, and try to conclude in the end and what could connect them. The Tallinn School of Architects emerged in the early 1970s as a group of young graduates from the Estonian State Art Institute who positioned themselves critically vis-a-vis the growing Soviet modernization and mass housing areas. Opposed to the narrow specialization of the previous generation of architects, this group also actively sought dialogue and cooperation with other cultural fields. In parallel to the design work in the Collective Farm Design Office in Tallinn, several architects in this group published polemical articles in the cultural media and urban issues and the built environment, drawing attention to the forgotten heritage of the early 20th century or discussing changes in contemporary world architecture. They also worked on samizdat translations of works by contemporary Western architects, for example, postmodernists like Robert Venturi or Aldo Rossi, but also closer colleagues from Finland with whom they were in direct contact. Lapin wrote reviews on avant-garde art and architecture from early 20th century, particularly Estonian functionalism and Russian supremacism. The critique of mass construction and alienation in the new housing districts of Tallinn reached its high point in Architectural Exhibition 78 at the Academy of Sciences Library which displayed projects that addressed directly the prefabricated suburbs and the changed profession of the architect. The already mentioned cemetery project by Lapin, which surprised the other participants as well, caught the most attention and caused a small sensation in the writings of the establishment figures it referred to. Its direct attack on the country's leading architects, Mart Port and Malle Meerak, they were buried here under the central obelisk, was unprecedented at the time. Lapin's work also offered a reference to the destruction of large-scale housing projects in the West, and this is a sort of a quasi-Malevichian scene in the corner up here, an explosion carried out as a suprematist composition that referenced, in Lapin's own words, the demolition of mass housing in Pruitt-Igoe in US in 1972, which was a famous moment for Charles Jenks to say that modern architecture is dead. However, Lapin himself chose not to demolish the area, but rather to refunction or transform it through this bizarre intervention. Other works from the exhibition had similar critical content. Architect Harry Shane showed allegorical black and white montage images of the 4 prefabricated housing areas in Tallinn, with a corpse and a vandalized car in front of a partly ruined prefabricated apartment building in Mustamäe, which was the first of the modernist blocks during the Khrushchev's thaw in 1960s. Or the Kaljundis display at the exhibition placed the question of freedom of choice in the context of the small town. So how was the consciousness of the inhabitants of small towns to be raised so that they would not leave for larger cities and yet be offered comparable diversity, asked Kaljundi. Analyzing the existing architecture of the small towns, he showed photographs of facades as screens facing onto the main street, making the buildings behind them appear larger and more imposing than in actuality. And this is obviously was inspired by recent discussions in Western postmodern architecture. And Lapin himself showed an ironic but perhaps also utopian proposal for the new skyline of Tallinn, which staged the city as the New York of Estonia, as he said, with the several skyscrapers recalling Malevich's architecture. And here's a direct reference to Malevich's montage of an architect in New York skyline. So in many ways, contrary to the later postmodern projects, these examples demonstrate the younger generation of architects engaging with a socialist modernist environment, critiquing mass housing production while refusing to turn their backs on the overall ethics of modernism. Projects like Lapin Skyline used avant-garde aesthetics to counter the dullness of official building production without thereby completely contradicting the dominant Soviet system. Such works blurred the boundaries between withdrawal outside and engagement within that system. Equally, Lapin's views on mass housing were balanced or balancing on the board of official endorsement and dissident withdrawal. In Moscow, a comparable critique of the limitations of the architect's position in Soviet society emerged in the projects of the students of the Moscow Architecture Institute in the mid-1970s and early 1980s. These practitioners already became known during their studies for their successful entries in international architectural competitions, initially those organized by UNESCO, but later also in conceptual competitions sponsored by magazines like Japan Architect or Architectural Design, where no restrictions in terms of budget, site, or building systems could rein in their sense of fantasy. And here are some of the members of this group, with Mikhail Belov on the left lower here, who is actually the architect of the same Impersky Dome that Anthony showed in his previous paper. But he's now very young here and starting only at the start of his career. In Mikhail Belov's and Yuri Avakumov's entry for the Japan Architect Central Glass Competition Museum of Sculpture, a work called Sepulchral Skyscraper or Metropolitan Self-Elevating Columbarium from 1983, their take on the Soviet modernist heritage was close to the works of the Tallinn School. The project showed a high-rise with a rectangular plan built on of black tombs lifted on top of each other by red cranes. The identically shaped burial units filling out each floor could be personalized with monuments for the loved ones, as they said. We see a monument to a soccer player here. This is very tiny in this image, but nevertheless, perhaps you can see. The skyscraper showed similarities in style with one of the towers in Ivan Leonidov's 1934 entry for the Commissariat for Heavy Industry across the Red Square from the Kremlin, with its red cranes referencing the suspended steel terraces on top of the structure. And these are the cranes here. We obviously have an interesting parallel going on with this work from the 80s. If this combination of dark irony and avant-garde aesthetics was close to Lapin's cemetery in a prefabricated micro-district, then rather than bringing to light what had remained hidden, as Lapin did, Belov and Avakumov's project multiplied in some way something that had been visible on the Red Square all along, the immortal body of the sovereign as the organizing principle of the communist state. In August 1984, several of the entries for the international architecture competitions were exhibited in the show Paper Architecture in the editorial office of the youth magazine Юность in Moscow. Gathering together more than 30 participants, it displayed a selection of competition works, drawings, posters, and models. The exhibition was displayed along the corridor and in the two smaller halls of the editorial office, with works and photographs hung along the walls between two plates of glass. Like in the Tallinn exhibition, of which there was no direct knowledge in Moscow, it has to be said, the participants represented a mix of diverse styles and approaches. In Mikhail Belov's and Dmitry Velichkin's colored cardboard model for a UNESCO competition was a proposal for rebuilding a typical multi-story Soviet panel house set in a fictional People's Republic in Africa. In Avakumov's work and Evgeny Assis and Avakumov's work called Urban Applications investigated the empty parcels of land around transportation hubs, metro stations, and bus stops, proposing a catalog of standard elements that could be used in various circumstances to put up temporary structures and organized space around so-called mini centers, adding their kiosks or pavilions for socialization. And also in the overall composition, how this image has been set, you of course recognize some references to suprematism again. This was taken further in Avakumov's and Marhi student City of Kla project, the prize-winning entry in the style for the year 2001 competition organized by the magazine Architecture and Urbanism, Japanese magazine. It showed an intervention to the standard panel housing area in Moscow, appropriating the aesthetic of the 1920s avant-garde for redefining a generic panel house area from the 60s. Focusing on empty territories between the houses, the constructivist elements were used to build open-ended and transformable structures where the users themselves could come up with possible functions, like amateur clubs, dovecotes, mini theaters, pavilions, and change their environment over time. And these are the representations of these different separate functions here on the left side. Employing black iron girders with diagonal rods and red flags on top, it reminded of an agitprop workers club that had been dispersed across the whole housing area. As the text on the project drawing explained, the problem of the standard micro-round district lied in the lack of communication between people and isolation that characterized the 1960s planning principle. The early Soviet avant-garde was reclaimed in the works of Moscow architects then. Avakumov himself explained that instead of a prosperous middle-class architecture, the City of Kla project was imagined as a proletarian one. Instead of realistic multi-story panel housing, it was seen as an absurd paper project, as he wrote at the time. The temporary structures reinterpreting the 1920s avant-garde appeared now more as a circus, as he said, rather than a theater, axionometric drawing rather than perspective, a barricade rather than a colonnade. This is Avakumov's words. In many ways, he could be seen not only reviving a past aesthetic language, but using it as a valid form for experimentation and reactivating local inhabitants. a rhetoric becoming dominant in perestroika after 1986, but we are dealing with 1984 here. So I want to come finally back and draw this to a conclusion to the questions I posed in the beginning on the position of these practices vis-a-vis the official architectural doctrine, and then the tactics used in this critique, and relate this to the topic of the conference, that is recycling. Firstly, I want to suggest that the use of avant-garde aesthetics allow the distancing from the dominant architectural elite and room to criticize the reduction of architecture as an appendage of the construction industry, but on the other hand, allowed an intervention in the architectural institutions in order to alter their practice. The use of the interwar avant-garde embodied the values of experimentation and utopianism in agreement with a socialist country, but they also believed that radical aesthetics could counter the dullness of official building production by ironically adapting while still maintaining socialist values. And here I'm relying on Alexei Yurchak's interpretation of this deterritorialization in late Soviet process of the in late Soviet period of the official language, and this kind of productive deterritorialization that he writes about in his 2006 book. Rather than being openly antagonistic, this new discourse was constructed inside and in contiguity with the official one. And secondly, in thinking of the tactics of these architects, the concept of recycling and its focus on the material aspects of cultural transformation could point to the ways in which these late Soviet architectural interventions differ from the Western counterparts. And this is part of a larger argument how to talk about postmodernism in the second world. Literary scholar Marilyn Randall has shown how recycling in its environmental sense focuses on the waste rather than what she calls detritus. So waste that would not transform naturally on its own. And she says, I quote, "Contemporary waste, if recyclable, figures primarily as the return of the excessive, that which is not the wine, not the food, not the object of consumption," unquote. It was the interest in this excessive surplus of modernization or disorganization and waste as entropy that was the focus of several of the conceptual projects from the 1970s and 80s. The industrial production and disciplinary order that had emerged during the modern era had been based on the principle that surplus energy should be excluded from the system as waste, which then posed a threat from the outside. The interest of these architects that I discussed in the excess of modernization made visible the unsettling other, which being useless or disorderly was shut out from the system's borders. Even more, in some cases, their works put it into new productive use, like in Kaljund's view of a new visual environment that proposed redeveloping slag heaps in mining areas, feeding the surplus waste from mining oil shale back into the system as recreational landscape, thus neutralizing also their threatening visual presence, all up in City of the Living, City of the Dead, and Avakumov's and Belov's skyscraper that could equally be seen as an attempt to integrate death as a repressed other to everyday urban life and turn the threat into laughter and play. From today's perspective, these projects occurred at the moment of inception of a redefined idea of the environment that incorporated previously excluded spaces into new productive territories of the city. By the end of the 20th century, urban otherness and former wastelands had become major vehicles in the regeneration of North American and European cities, including those in the former Soviet and socialist countries, recognizing their potential for the post-industrial urban economy. The critical projects of the Tallinn and Moscow architects show the prehistory of these transformations and could be seen to contain an alternative to the dominant trajectory. Thank you very much. Piotr, we don't hear you.
I'm sorry. Andres, thank you very much for presentation. And now Julia Descheper from Kunsthistorisches Institute in Florence, Max Planck Institute, will be the third speaker. And her paper is entitled recycling constructivism, marketing for preserving, or preserving for branding. Julian, please.
Can you see my screen? Yes, okay.
Yes.
Okay. So thank you very much also from my side, and good afternoon, everyone. I'm very happy to attend this conference, and also because I was really stimulated by the proposed concept of culture recycle that offers indeed interesting options to nuance the well-established approaches when describing the now uses of the Soviet cultural past in post-Soviet countries. And so I've been using the term recycling more in my work, speaking about socialist monuments, treatment, especially sculpture, so directly relating to the materiality of monuments and to the action, the real action of properly recycling them. And today I will use this conceptual framework to share with you more some thoughts about a question I've been studying since a few years now, but that happened to have quite changed while I was doing my PhD research. That is the avant-garde architecture preservation in post-Soviet Russia. And specifically, I will tackle this issue from the perspective of a rather new phenomenon, as I just said, what I call the marketization of avant-garde architecture and its uses as a new local, regional, or national brand. And so my paper analyzes this phenomenon into context, into cities, Moscow and Yekaterinburg. And it's interesting because these two, what happened in these two cities diverge greatly in terms of actors involved, stakes and perspective, and also actions. The theoretical framework of the socialist culture recycle is particularly relevant here as it allows really to capture the multi-layered ambitions of these actors and multivocal narrative at stakes in this marketization process. Sorry for that. And so let me start with paradoxes and contradictions, because my paper will focus on especially on that. Yes. So in 2017, while the anniversary of the revolution was, as we know now, a silent jubilee, Moscow, on the contrary, celebrated its 870th anniversary very loudly. And what is interesting for us is that the official posters, videos, website design were all inspired by the famous textile ornaments created by the artist Varvara Stepanova and Lyubov Popova in the early 20s. Then Moscow streets were also decorated with Vasily Kandinsky and Kazimir Malevich artwork in 3 dimensions, as you can see here, and Moscovites could also stroll past miniatures of several avant-garde architecture masterpieces. The first one was the Melnikov House, built by the architect Konstantin Melnikov, which is maybe one of the most architect house, it's very iconic of the 20th century. And as you can see, it was reproduced like that in the center of Moscow, and citizen could play, have a drink inside, or like playing with this miniature Melnikov house. The other 2 avant-garde buildings chosen to be miniaturized were, as you can see on the left, the Bakhnetyevsky garage, also by the same architect Melnikov, and on the right, the Shuhov Tower by the architect and engineer Shuhov, and it was the first radio tower in Bolshevik Russia. And this proud exhibition in Moscow street during an official event appeared apparently quite contradictory if we look at the state of conservation of this building, let's say in real life, but also as we can notice that these 3 buildings were not chosen haphazardly. Indeed, these 3 examples are, so this is another example of the Shuhov Tower in the posters or different paper given during the event. Indeed, actually the garage, the Schuhaf Tower, and the Melnikov House are three examples of great and very recent restorations or preservation process, but really recent, because the garage was actually transformed into a museum only in 2008. It was actually the host of the Garage Museum first, and then in 2012, now is the host of the Еврейский музей. And it's really restoration with revitalization of the building and really a modern exhibition, permanent exhibition, as you can see here. Then the Melnikov House is another trickier example, because the Melnikov House was actually threatened for years, and also the international community, especially World Monument Fund, several times appeal for its conservation and put it on his watch list of monuments in danger in 2006. This monument was also one at the center of the Moscow Declaration signed in 2006 by several, let's say, heritage organizations, UNESCO, ICOMOS, and the Comomom, in order to preserve it. So the worrying state of conservation of this building was at the center of the international heritage community. And it's only in 2015 that the house, after some several stories of expropriation, were actually taken by the Shusef Museum in 2015 and was retransformed into a museum that you could visit. And as you can see, now you have some new panels that can give you some information about the building. The last example of the Schuhaf Tower is also quite interesting, because as it was presented, and as you could see during the Moscow anniversary, at the center of excursion with children playing on it, actually in 2014, the Schuhaf Tower was threatened of demolition. And it's only thanks to a mobilization of citizens, on which I will talk later, that the tower was actually saved and started to be restored in 2016. So it's quite interesting. On the one side, we have this reality, and on the other side, we have this several letters of this advertisement of three avant-garde building. Let me say just very briefly a few words on what is avant-garde, but mostly what are the ideas maybe that are embodied by this building. Of course, there is a sophisticated body of literature that has recently explored and renewed the knowledge on avant-garde architecture, and I'm thinking especially of Catherine Cook, Christine Ronberg, Kristina Kayer, or Anke Zalivako, to quote just a few, that mainly, and to put it to summarize it, that explain that this architecture that was built between the 20s and 30s, often reduced to the term constructivism, was revolutionary from an aesthetical but also political point of view. And the architect in charge of the construction wanted to create a new way of living, of interacting with each other and with the space inside and outside the building, let's say. And this architecture actually is now really part of the design of socialist city, but also still very present in the post-socialist city. What is maybe important for us today is that, and it's not a well-known phenomenon, but most of these buildings were also protected as heritage already during the Soviet period, especially after three, let's say, wave of preservation, 67, 74 and 87 at different level, local, regional, and national level. However, despite this heritage status, most of these buildings have been, after the end of the USSR, largely abandoned, neglected, stigmatized, and sometimes destroyed. And since the 2000s, the year 2000s, as I mentioned, this worrying state of conservation was really extensively documented by art historian inside and outside of Russia. So I'm giving you other example to see visually what kind of monument we're talking about: collective building, worker clubs, theaters, but also habitation. This worrying state of conservation was especially embodied by the Dom Narkomthim, which was placed 3 times on the World Monument Watch list in 2002, 2004, and 2006. And here is the inside, and here this is the last one of the last demolition of avant-garde building, Taganskaya building in 2015, and communal and a house on the right. And indeed, this actually, despite the heritage status, these buildings were not integrated, let's say, to the national heritage of post-Soviet Russia. Rather, what we could define as proper heritage, and that relates to the paper of Anthony, could be embedded here on this poster with like more national, classical, and also somehow I don't want to say Stalinist architecture, but at least the idea carried by some of the Stalinist monuments, which were directly accepted as the heritage of post-Soviet Russia. We have this on the one hand, but on the other hand, constructivism, or let's say avant-garde, because when we say constructivism, sometimes it also relates to suprematism, as in art history, has become exactly at the same moment of on the one side, we have the architecture, the state of preservation that was decreasing, and the other side, the trend among constructivism was rising. So you can see here a photo taken in museum, for instance, and really you have this multiplication of images and this attraction for the colors, the aesthetic, the geometric patterns, evocative colors that are really a new trend, and you can you have a large range of different objects, postcards, notebooks, badges, jewelry, clothes, etc., that multiply in the same time. And what is interesting is that architecture from the side of the citizen was not stranger to this fashion phenomenon. And progressively and quite interestingly, because of the paradoxical here mechanism, avant-garde building were suddenly also reproduced on kitsch, funny, and fashionable goodies, sometimes distributed freely, but almost for sales. But what is interested for us here is the uses of the images of the building, and both visually and materially speaking, and the recycling of both the visual culture and the material culture of avant-garde into context. The first in Moscow, what is interesting here is that in order to protect the Shuhav Tower that I told you was threatened, the citizens that initiated the movement of preservation consciously referred to the images of the avant-garde. So here we can make very broadly reference with most of them, like the most famous posters. And in order to raise the awareness of the population, the tower was reproduced and it's on different object. But what is interesting is that somehow the image and the shape of the tower became more important than the architectural object itself, and it was more the new emblem and symbol that kind of was used in order to raise the awareness and to mobilize the population to preserve the tower. And you can see that also during mobilization, people with shirts. And here I thought it was fascinating because it arrives also directly on the body of some of the citizen mobilized for the tower. And a few years later, when the tower was not demolished, you can find it again on T-shirts, somehow advertising also in a funny way the way it was saved. And this actually T-shirt was sold inside the Narcomfin building, in itself reproduced on these little pins that you have. And here it's very interesting because ironically, these buildings are branded with means that were rejected by their architect. The reproduction of these building images are an embodiment of the consumer society, is in contradiction with the intellectual and political ideas held by their architect. But on the other hand, this was also a good, let's say, a good way in order to raise the awareness, but also to have concrete impact. And for instance, the restoration of the Narcomfin that started finally in 2017 is now finished. And so you have both the impact from below, from the citizen, that seem progressively to arrive and to have concrete results. On the contrary, in Yekaterinburg, the phenomenon was completely different because, and if we take the example of the White Tower, which is one of the emblem of the city, was progressively restored by citizens, but also completely promoted by the local and then regional government. So here during Subotniki, so also recycling properly a Soviet technique in order to preserve a Soviet monument. And then the image of the tower transformed into an icon, into the emblem of the city, was used, but not in order to raise the awareness for the preservation, but as a way to brand the city with the tower. So basically, it's completely the inverse phenomenon. The tower was used in the same way in Moscow, but for the Narcomfin, but now the tower was already restored, so it was more a promotion of the restoration. But it was not only the White Tower; also diverse constructivist building of Yekaterinburg had the same destiny and miniaturization. And more importantly, the days of constructivism started since 2015. And the main purpose is to say that Yekaterinburg is an open-air museum of constructivism. We want to make it as a local architectural brand. And the first idea was to have a positive social consensus on avant-garde, наследие авангарда, and in other cities of the region. Consensus, scientifically speaking, for the community, but also social impact. And in the little brochure that you had, and I read only the red sentence, the idea was like Soviet architects made an enormous contribution in the world of architecture, and we want to preserve constructivism and make it more popular. And so here, after years of neglect, basically you have what I call the reauthorizing discourses of avant-garde, taking the expression of Lorenzen Smith, in order to again consider these monuments as heritage of the city. And this was completely stated as at an official level, and it was also promoted because indeed the local government and regional and then progressively national wanted to promote Yekaterinburg as the capital of constructivism. And apparently they did manage, because if you do a little research now on Yekaterinburg, it's the capital of Russian constructivism, but also broad constructivist capital when we quote Yekaterinburg in The Guardian, for instance, in the Moscow Time, or in different journals. More importantly, from the moment Yekaterinburg was rebranding, because really also the word that is always used is this idea of branding, to create a brand image of the city with iconic building, is actually to inscribe those monuments on the UNESCO list, which is quite fascinating because it happened exactly at the same years where monuments in Moscow were threatened of destruction. This led also to sometimes contradictory or not contradictory, but problematic point, because there is in this emphasizing of the greatness of avant-garde only put a positive ideas on this exceptional contribution to the world architecture, a complete decontextualization, dehistorization, and de-ideologization, you understood me, of this architecture, which could be problematic, especially in building that have let's say, a dark history, as this house of the Czechist, for instance, which is completely linked with the politic of repression. And so to reproduce it and to brand the house of Czechist as one of the contribution to architecture and to keep the name, but also to put it on the UNESCO list, could be also problematic from this the perception of the memory that this building could carry. What is interesting is that this phenomenon of really recycling constructivism in Yekaterinburg sometimes somehow had an effect in Moscow as a boomerang effect. And this is how and why we can explain how Moscow was promoted also with the avant-garde architecture in 2017. And the network, we can explain that because of the network of the people, the circulation of ID, but also as the progressive realization that actually constructivism as such, or avant-garde, could be an economic, let's say, source of revenue, could attract tourists, especially at the international level. And so the insistence on the tourist outside of Russia is what is the most underlined in several texts that are available. And we can, to conclude, we can see that this effect since 2017 and the use of avant-garde architecture in Moscow did continue, especially with the World Cup. One of the attraction that was available on the website was the idea that constructivism, наследие советской эпохи, so the really integration of heritage, of constructivism as heritage, and the declaration, which is completely new, because in 2011 and 2013 we have declaration of officials from the Moscow government that are officially saying that avant-garde should be left as unbuilt architecture, which should not be built, or on the contrary, that it was does not have an heritage value anymore to post-Soviet Russia. And so in 2018, we see this promotion officially on the website with the use of this word. And also, I will conclude with this image of this idea of this kind of montage, quite fascinating, using the history of Russia and the main character, but using, let's say, constructivist or suprematist framework. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much. And now is the time for a paper of Barbara Dudas from the Institute of Art History Research Center for the Humanities, ILKH in Budapest. And her paper is entitled Hungarian Socialist Murals and Tapestries Recycled, the Case of Gyula Hinz. Barbara, please.
Thank you very much for the introduction. And thank you all for sticking around for the last presentation of the day. This paper, I will examine the role of monumental socialist modernist art in the so-called Kádár era of Hungary, and through taking a closer look at specific monumental works designed by a popular state-supported artist of the time, Gyula Hinz, I will discuss how the relationship towards these artworks shifted after the political regime change of 1989. The commissions for monumental public art pieces at the time were controlled by an administrative authority of the supervisory body for arts and crafts, in short, the so-called lectorate in Hungary, which was one of the main state institutions that controlled and supervised all cultural processes of the country from around the mid-60s. These monumental public art pieces are generally difficult to define and classify, as there are not necessarily just murals. An article written in 2017, focusing on the built heritage of the post-war era of Hungary, uses very broad terms of artifacts completing architecture or artworks of attendant art. These categories include both artworks that are structurally integral with the building, meaning reliefs, murals, frescoes, secos, sgraffitos, wall mosaics, stained glass windows, as well as artworks that are not specifically designed for the building, but not structurally integral with it. Sculptures on the facade and inside of the building, large panel paintings and tapestries. On the other hand, this group of works are often, and particularly in regional comparisons, referred simply to as monumental socialist public works, including the freestanding public monument sculptures too in the category. In the Hungarian context, however, the issue of Soviet-era monuments, sculptures, is seen more as a separate and often heated topic, especially in Budapest, where many socialist public sculptures were relocated after 1989-1990 to a themed statue park called Memento Park, located in an outer district of the city. My examination will therefore not focus on the public monuments and sculptures. I will, however, keep using the term monumental socialist public art, not only for the sake of simplicity, but because both monumentality and publicity are important factors to consider when it comes to discussing these types of artworks. They were specifically designed for public buildings, universities and schools, school buildings, party headquarters, houses of culture, conference halls, hotels, libraries, embassies, and so on, and imagined to be impressive, large-scale pieces that could decorate the given space while at the same time mediate, communicate a desired message through their aesthetic qualities. These messages were not independent from the contemporary political interests. However, over time, they became more and more subtle and in line with the architecture of the buildings themselves, more and more modern. The works all vary in dimension and require different level of technical preparedness and knowledge from the artist. What connects them in this period are most of all the circumstances of how, by whom, and to whom they were commissioned. From the mid-1950s, the so-called 2000s decree determined that from 2,000 to 5,000 of the budget of every state building project had to be spent on ordering decorative artworks for the building. The works were commissioned by the lectorate through both open calls and invitation-only competitions, and the competing artists received an honorary fee for each plan they have prepared, even those who have not won the competition at the end. Naturally, the winning artists received another bigger sum for the final plans, but in most of the cases, they were not responsible for manufacturing the actual piece, especially because oftentimes the competing artists, mainly painters and graphic artists, were not specialized in creating large-scale pieces, did not have the necessary technical skills, equipment, and studio space to perform a job of this size. So in most of the cases, the final artworks were produced, carried out in a specific state-run workshops, as we see on these images. Gyula Hinz was a highly productive and manifold painter, graphic artist, book illustrator, and designer of monumental public works, who built a rather successful career from the late 1920s until the late 1980s in Hungary. Trained as an avant-garde expressionist painter with surrealist and constructivist qualities, he became a teacher of graphic art and painting in Budapest. From the 1950s on, he regularly represented Hungary at international group and solo exhibitions, received state prize after state prize, as well as several state commissions for monumental art pieces. His monumental designs for schools, universities, houses of culture, party buildings, and hotels, those that survived the past decades, are scattered around in various Hungarian cities, including but not limited to Budapest. As in his various other activities, he was the most productive in this field during the 1960s. He was teaching and working as a rector at the Academy of Applied Arts until 1963, while he was very active and successful as graphic artist as well as book illustrator. He was widely exhibited in and outside of Hungary, and in 1970, he represented Hungary together with sculptor József Somogyi at the 35th Venice Biennial, with a big monographic exhibition where he exhibited a great number of paintings, graphics, statues, and 3 large-scale tapestries. Even though these monumental commissions were considered as high-profile opportunities to the selected artists, and the final pieces were celebrated being traditional in technique, modern in form, and socialist in spirit, and regularly discussed by both the press and the general public at the time, after 1989-1990, their story started to change rapidly. From a museological, art historical perspective, they exist today in the gray zone of cultural heritage. Their protection is not defined by any clear law or regulation, which can lead to complicated legal matters when a building is renovated, rebuilt, or demolished. They are rarely considered as autonomous artworks, being stuck with the architecture environment they were originally designed for. As products, mementos of a bygone era and political ideology, these works were clearly not in focus after the political regime change. They rarely became part of museum collections, and if so, they mostly ended up forgotten in storages. At least this is how it is in Hungary and Central Europe. So who is interested in them nowadays? The afterlife of socialist heritage in Eastern Europe shows quite a few regional similarities. In Hungary, the monumental public works were first rediscovered by non-academic architecture enthusiasts who are interested in and susceptible to public art and preserving the fading memories of state socialism. So while certain statues were relocated in the 1990s to the already mentioned Memento Park that primarily operates as a tourist attraction these days, thematic city walks focusing on the built heritage of the period gained unexpected popularity in the past few years. Here are some examples of groups that are organizing these kind of thematic city walks. And parallel to the growing interest of local activists, scholarly research towards socialist modernist architecture also started to take shape. In Hungary, the architectural collection of Kistelin Museum, that is part of the Budapest History Museum, started a photo-based documentation project called Virtual Archiving, which focuses on public buildings and of Budapest erected in this period that will possibly be demolished soon. A similar regional project is the Socialist Modernism initiative designed by the Bureau for Art and Urban Research in Romania, which again puts its focus on the protection and research on built heritage. When it comes to architectural monuments, there is no international regional database or ongoing research project that would solely focus on these types of artworks. They only appear in as the subject of national case studies in specific textbooks and art journals, or as historical references to contemporary art projects. In the Hungarian context, again, there is one small project, an online community and collectively built database called Köztérkép that collects documents and somewhat subjectively describes public art pieces, which makes the website a useful starting point even for academic research on these works. And here is the profile of Gyula Hinz on Köztérkép. The archival material of the lectorate is kept today at the archives of the Hungarian National Gallery, including most of the original documentation of the monumental public works that were commissioned in this time. And let's see some examples. The tapestry entitled Harmony, we see here, was commissioned in the mid-60s for the so-called FÉSZEK Artist Club located in inner Budapest. It was on view in Venice in 1970, but ever since it got home from Italy, it has been on the wall of the club. The final composition depicts a musician, a cellist on the left, and a mother and child couple on the right, sitting in front of a non-figurative background. Both the figure of the musician and the mother and child couple are recurrent motifs in Hinz's art, especially the latter. As a symbol of a new life, he often uses them in different scenarios in context of a family or as a reminder of constant development in our ever-changing world. He uses the same mother and child couple on a tapestry entitled Science he designed just a few years earlier for the University of Debrecen. As the university's main focus was on agriculture or science, Hinz used various motifs that can be connected with agriculture, as well as the development of science. Both tapestries were designed for specific institutions, and both were exhibited at the Venice Biennial in 1970. In 2018, the Kirchsteli Museum and Transit HU organized a research-based exhibition entitled 1971 Parallel Non-Synchronism in Budapest that focused on the parallel tendencies of art in state socialist Hungary, more specifically in the period between 1968 and 73. The exhibition examined the complex relationship of two defining generations of artists working simultaneously in Hungary, having different, sometimes intertwined relationship with the state apparatus. One of the case studies installations we see in these images were introducing the spaces and figures of official art of the period, focusing on the artists that represented Hungary at the 35th and 36th Venice Biennials, namely Gyula Hinz, József Somogyi, and Endre Domanovsky. On the other hand, 1971 marks the date of the first conceptual art project of Hungary initiated by art historian László Becker. The original idea of parallel non-synchronism exhibition was to show works connected to both case studies, including tapestries Hinz exhibited in Venice. Interestingly, however, neither the University of Debrecen nor the FÉSZEK Club agreed to take down and loan their tapestry for the contemporary exhibition, not even after being offered that the works would be professionally restored on the occasion. Luckily, unlike many other artists' plans for monumental public works, most of Hinz's plans were saved by the artist himself and kept today in a museum in Vác, where a great portion of Hinz's oeuvre is held since 1990. Thus, instead of the original tapestry, the parallel non-synchronism exhibition could at least show one of the final colored one-to-one scale plans, the one we see in the image, providing a unique look into the process of creating the monumental work. Around the same time, a photo shoot for a contemporary women's wear company, Tomcsányi, took place at the retro-looking salon of the FÉSZEK Club for their 2018 fall-winter line. According to the website of the company, their design is generally inspired by socialist modernist aesthetic. The salon of the club has this grayish green carpet on the floor, brownish orange 70s style armchairs, thick velvety drapes in front of the windows, and of course a faded woven tapestry, Hinz's Harmony on the back. The room can be rented for events, exhibitions, and photo shoots, which is considered an important source of income for the institution. The tapestry, which is with its now moderate colors, fits perfectly to the retro-looking interior that for the generation grown up in the post-socialist Eastern Europe means something different than for those willing to erase even the slightest memory of the socialist past. For the time it was commissioned, the tapestry seemed as a Western-inspired but still socialist modern artwork. Then for the generation who fought 1989, something that should be forgotten, only to turn something new again by the 30th anniversary of the regime change, a design element of a retro interior. And by being that, an aesthetic object, the work becomes, to quote Katarina Preda, a decommunized, depoliticized version of socialist art. In her recent article, Preda argues that, and I quote, these monuments are no longer seen as an expression of former communist regimes, but as pure aesthetic objects that are not defined by the political context in which they were created, end of quote. While I'll agree with her argument, especially when looking at the case of Hinz's Harmony, I do feel that the process of depoliticization comes at a cost. By neglecting or even erasing the immediate political social conditions of artistic production, the artwork becomes an empty combination of form and style. When Harmony was not allowed to be included in a research exhibition, but was utilized as a prop in a photo shoot, the artwork, instead of being seen as an important and still existing artifact of a contested period, has become a commercial product, a commodity. Similarly to those works of Hinz that appeared a few years ago in a background of a Hollywood production, a spy movie from, again, 2018, entitled Red Sparrow, that is partially set and therefore was shot in Hungary. Two monumental public works of his can be spotted in the movie. The first is an earlier mosaic from the 1950s entitled Celebration. The other is his last and also largest monumental piece, a glass window from the early 1980s entitled Science Microworld. The mosaic was designed in the 1950s for the entrance hall of the House of Culture in Várpalota. That was originally connected to the Inota thermal power plant complex that was built in the 50s and operated until 2001. It depicts a group of people celebrating, walking, playing, and listening to music in a socialist realist manner. The building has rich decorations, all from the 1950s. Today, it is used as a retro theater with its modernist auditorium that is quite unique in the country. In the movie, however, the building is located in Russia and introduced shortly as a training school for the Russian intelligence service. Here is one frame from the movie, and on the right we can see the mosaic. The scene where Hinz's mosaic can be seen is a quite depressing and heavy scene of training the Secret Service agents. The other work of Hinz appears at a later point in the movie that is set in Budapest, where the two main characters meet in a big conference-like event. The location here is unnamed, but in the background of the hall, Hinz's largest stained glass window can be seen. The 147 square meters non-figurative glass window is located in the entrance hall of the theoretical building of another university, Semmelweis University in Budapest, SOTE in short, which is a university of medicine and health sciences. Hinz got the commission for the large window in 1978, and the final work was revealed in 1982. It was his second window design, the first one entitled Technology and Science, was made for the so-called B2 building for the electrical engineering faculty of the Budapest University of Technology. Hinz was commissioned in 1968, and the final piece was revealed in 1971. It is located at the entrance hall of the building as a representative element facing the entrance. The colored window consists of 16 panels of the same size. As its title suggests, the piece is symbolically connected to the technical sciences. It combines figurative elements with pulsating, swirling, abstract forms and motifs. The building has not been used since 2012. It was left abandoned until last year, when its demolition was officially announced. However, this process has not yet started. In the popular online media, the building is often ranked as one of the ugliest buildings of Budapest. And as such, no one really protests against its demolition, while Hinz's stained glass window is still appreciated to this day, mostly due to its unique and rare nature. As journalist Miklós Vince who, unlike others, thoroughly researched the history of the building and pointed out its historical importance, mentioned in his article published on a Hungarian online site, Hinz's technology and science should be a protected artwork, and as such, will definitely be saved before the demolition of the building. Unfortunately, the matter is not this simple. The protection of cultural heritage and cultural goods is a tricky territory in Hungary these days. It falls under the supervision of a department of the Cabinet Office of the Prime Minister, the Inspectorate of Cultural Goods, which is responsible for declaring artworks protected. Technology and science has not been protected artwork until 2021. The legal process only began late last year. And here is the official data sheet that declares it as a protected artwork. And luckily, this does not mean that the window would not be saved according to the current plans before the wrecking ball arrives to the building. The window is going to be professionally removed from the building, and after a thorough cleaning and some minor restorations, it will be relocated to one of the other buildings of the university. Thanks to the university and the Faculty of Electrical Engineering itself, who not only recognize the value of Hinz's work and the fact that this piece was specifically designed for them, but with the help of non-academic architecture and art enthusiasts again, even shot a farewell homage video about the building and its rich history. The story of the BMA building, BMA window is a relatively successful one, even though there is no telling when the window will actually be renovated and when will eventually be revealed in a new location, but at least it's going to be saved. In the meantime, it's one-to-one scale black and white plans that for some unknown reason never made it back to the artist studio, started to reappear on the art market, being sold at the same price point as Hinz's paintings from the 1970s. There is a double standard in operation regarding these monumental socialist public works. On the one hand, they are considered as spectacular, colorful pieces that fit into certain visual interpretations that results in recycling them as props for photo shoots and movies and retro theaters. While on the other hand, they are seen as means of ideological propaganda, simply addendums to the original architectural plans, and as such, they could neither become part of the academic discourse developed until after 1989, nor could they ever truly be depoliticized. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Barbara. I would like to thank all the panelists for very interesting presentations. For discipline, it was first session with 4 papers. And now I encourage you to ask questions. Valerie, okay. We can hear you.
I have a question to Andreas Kurk and some comments concerning his paper. Thank you very much for a very interesting paper. This situation is interesting. Our research group mostly focuses on post-Soviet recycling. So this is our main subject. But the paradox is that when we begin to talk about the post-Soviet recycling, the field of recycling inside Soviet culture is very important. We cannot ignore discussion of this period. pre-post-Soviet period when we are talking about cultural recycling. It's a little bit strange, and but it is true. It is true. So I very appreciate Andreas Kurk, who focuses exactly at this matter, at this stuff. And I think when I listened to Andreas, I thought several, I invented several ideas, and one of them was about relation between the subject which was described by Andreas with idea of postmodernism. It is exactly was surprising for me when Andreas came to this idea as well. We know that the first very authoritative discussion about postmodernism was held exactly in relation to the architecture. But interesting that Frederick Jamieson, who initiated this discussion, didn't use the term cultural recycling almost at all, especially in his early studies about postmodernism. By contrast with his colleague and opponent, Hal Foster, who used it, applying it to neo-avant-gardist painting mostly. But this is just my comment. I don't know how, I just would like to share it with you. But my question is very simple. It is about a tiny detail which you described when you told about City of Dead. Yeah, this is exactly, it is impossible to ignore the fact that this point alludes to the idea famous for Soviet and post-Soviet culture, idea of the museum of the idea of museum, which was propagated, popularized the important Russian philosopher Nikolai Fyodorov. This is exactly his idea to move all public life. Private life is not important in his philosophy, to the cemetery. Exactly, this is exactly what we saw when you told about this project. Interesting. Do you think that this relation exactly is here?
Yeah, thank you for this question and comment. This is I actually have I have had this somewhere in my notes that I should try to look up this relationship to Fyodorov, because Lapin encountered Malevich first, at least his own stories, that he bought the Polish edition of the Bezpredmetny Mir at the end of 60s in an antiquariat in Tallinn, and then that was the first kind of encounter with Malevich. But then he also in St. Peter or Leningrad came into direct contact with Pavel Kondratiev, who was Malevich's student, and his knowledge of supremacists comes from that. And later he has written, but that's already in the 80s, he has written an article about Fyodorov's philosophy, Lapin, I mean. So he was aware, but I'm not sure if he was aware of him at that moment, and I haven't asked him about that, but this link would be definitely very interesting to study and make this connection, which I didn't. So thank you for reminding me. I have tried to what concerns postmodernism, then what I'm mainly interested in is telling the story how almost we in a way it's hard to avoid this term, because there was in Moscow and in Tallinn late 70s architects were aware of course of these tendencies and were in a dialogue with that, but at the same time I have tried to avoid it or in a way try to invent the ways how Soviet version of that was different, and that's why Jamieson is in a way not very useful source, because for him, of course, it's directly related to late capitalism, and so in a way I have tried to put this Jamiesonian version of postmodernism aside, or somewhere, you know, to be waiting its time, and in a way try to look at the differences really, and the difference for me, why I'm so interested in this recycling these housing areas, is really that because these architects themselves often lived in these areas, like Lapin, they of course didn't see them in this kind of nihilistic way that we should demolish them. But it really was a drive how to kind of intervene in there, and it sometimes took very playful forms. So that's for me is the main difference. That, like, you know, if Cenk says that this is the death of modernism, and we should demolish this kind of housing, and in a way this also socioeconomically is that 1980s in the West introduces this kind of a broader critique of social housing and privatization, then this is not the story at that point in the Soviet Union. So in a way, we have a possibility to tell a different story through these projects.
Thank you very much. Well, I understand.
Thank you. And we're waiting for next questions. Okay, Hans, please. And Hans, we can.
Yes, okay, I had to unmute myself. Thank you for really interesting presentations. I want to connect three of them a little bit that talk directly about the recycling or reintegration, or as Barbara said, depoliticization of Soviet art in our contemporary world. And we had the example by Antony Kalashnikov, namely Moscow and the Stalinist building, Stalinist architecture. Julie talked more about the returning to and reintegrating the avant-garde and constructivist times in St. Petersburg and Moscow. It was that comparison internally. And then Barbara, you talked about monumental artworks on buildings and so on. And these three examples really play very well of each other, I think. I was wondering, looking at the German case, where we have in Berlin, we've had this huge debate about architecture and urban planning in a city that, of course, had prime real estate going through the middle of the center after the wall fell and all this opened. And we know that the place that was formerly an aristocratic castle, the Berliner Stadtschloss, then became the site of the Haus der Republik, right, which was torn down. And now the Berliners, the Germans, are returning to a version of the Stadtschloss. That is, of course, a modernist version, not dated version, a postmodernist version, whatever you want to call it. But it's a very different way of going about it. And for Julie, what I find interesting is the different approaches in the province. Well, Yekaterinburg is not exactly the province, but historically it's been Moscow, it's been Leningrad, St. Petersburg, that were the center of Soviet display, Soviet culture, and so on. Why do you think Yekaterinburg had a more open take to recycling, reintegrating, foregrounding its modernist heritage than Moscow? What's going on, perhaps, in a kind of a regionalization of post-Soviet cityscapes and landscapes? That would be interesting if you have a theory or facts about that. Thank you.
No, thank you very much. First, for putting the paper in discussion, because also, and thank you for the organizer for putting us together, because I think they really resonate with each other, and especially on this idea of heritage or monuments that we are using more or less. Also, you, Andres, this idea of reutilizing in architecture old concept, etc. So I thought it really work well together, and I think afterwards I will also have question for my colleagues. But first, maybe to answer your question, or to give maybe just fruit for thoughts. The phenomenon I did observe in Yekaterinburg is really recent, and first in terms of also of chronology, we see that there is also a difference between the moment where in Moscow we notice people that start to raise the awareness of what's happening in Moscow, precisely a bit in St. Petersburg, but basically the turning point in 2006 with what we call the Moscow Declaration. And then 2009 there is another international conference, but then linking the heritage, avant-garde heritage of both St. Petersburg and some cities in Germany. So also putting that in an international framework. But it's only in 2000, let's say 10, 11, 12, that there is a beginning of interest in Yekaterinburg. So this difference is, I cannot explain myself the difference in the interest. However, what is the difference would be in terms of actors on the ground, their profile. And so I did sociological approach, more than 25 interviews in both cities, etc. So we have also different kind of profile in Yekaterinburg. But what is interesting is the, let's say, official support for that. And because it also came from citizen from above, with a group of young architects called Padielniki in 2013, and then it was progressively officialized, then financed by governmental support, this restoration, promotion, then publication, etc. So it's really, and it happened really, really fast. And what is interesting, and what would be the main argument, I would say first, the will at the local and regional level, because it's really supported by the region of Sverdlovsk, it's still called this way, is that first, Yekaterinburg doesn't have an international reputation, contrary to Moscow and St. Petersburg. So first, to attract maybe also tourists to the city. Then to have a new public, but also to have officially also a different approach to avant-garde compared to Moscow. And so here you have you need to add the political dimension, because for quite a time Yekaterinburg was also somehow an opposition, like opposition at the level of the mayor. And so for instance, Yevgeny Roisman, who was the mayor, declared himself in, I think it was 2013, if I'm not mistaken, that he said, Yevgeny Roisman za konstruktivism. So I am for constructivism in 2013. So in order to state through architecture, so the built environment, that he had a different approach, and also a different approach to the Soviet history, to Soviet heritage, and to the remains. So I think we could, to summarize, you have economical aspect, the aspect of tourism, but also political aspect, and then the idea of rebranding the city, and because from an historical perspective, there are several directions that the city could have taken. So this is the city where also the Tsar was murdered, you have all the industrial heritage, or you have the avant-garde. And so the choice was meant to put the accent on the avant-garde, and it works very well, given also the event and the attraction that it has today.
Barbara, Antony, would you like to answer too?
I'm not sure if the question was actually directed to me, but thank you very much for your comment, and also thank you from my side as well for the organizers, because I was really fascinated about how well these presentations go together. So I'm also really looking forward to discussing these matters more, and hopefully maybe even the future somehow working together, because I sometimes I feel a little bit alone with these topics, even in the Hungarian context, because it's not that much researched, and as I mentioned, this is more of a thing that for the non-academic discourse, and I feel like an activist myself within art historians, dealing with these topics, and dealing with questions of heritage protection of this period, because it's still a very much. This is why I'm a little bit biased with this depoliticization issue, because on one hand I feel that this is what is happening with these monumental works, but at the same time, when it comes to the academic research, it's very much politicized, and it's very much the reason why after 1989 these were not topics that were particularly of interest for art historians, and I think this could also be a generational issue, and maybe this is for my generation to work with, because I don't know when today it was already mentioned that our generation born before 1989, but not really having any clear memories of the era we are talking about. This is an interesting moment, I think, for a new generation to tackle these issues.
Just with regards to your comment about comparisons with the situation in Germany, I mean, I think that comparisons between the heritageization of Stalinist architecture in Russia and the treatment of Nazi architectural heritage in Germany is a very productive direction to take in research. But I also think that perhaps it's possible to think of the architecture of the time in a sort of a broadly interwar global setting as well, where monumental architecture in Stalinist Russia and Nazi Germany could be compared and put in dialogue with monumental architecture that's built as part of the New Deal program in America, but also similar developments in Britain and France at the time. And specifically with regards to my angle on the question, which is the construction of prospective monuments, that is, these monuments that are built for posterity to remember the era, we see that actually come up not just in totalitarian contexts like Russia and Germany at the time, but also in liberal democratic ones as well. Buildings are being designed for hundreds of years, and architects are making decisions about which materials to use, how to stylistically shape these buildings with a view to them standing for centuries. So thank you once again for your comment.
Thank you. Anyone else have a question? Valentina, please.
I have questions for Anthony. Anthony, I'm wondering if Russian memory politics somehow connected to the Stalinist monuments, or rather to say, if Stalinist monuments, this immortal Stalinist culture, can somehow influence the state memory about Stalin time. And second question about the region dimensions of the Stalinist monuments. You focus primarily on Moscow case, and there is no doubt that Moscow is the capital of Stalinist monuments. But if you go beyond Moscow, for example, to Kiev, when we have Khreshchatyk, the main street in Kiev, which completely Stalinist, Soviet army retreating just destroyed the street, not as was Soviet propaganda said it was made by Nazi Germany. So it was rebuilt and it looks completely Stalinist. So we have a Stalinist culture right in the center of Kiev. It even go beyond Kiev to Warsaw. In Warsaw we have the Palace of Culture and Science, so-called the Stalin's gift to Warsaw. And as far as I know, Poles also kind of discussed on this issue, and it's quite hard for them to kind of involve, to fit this building, this palace, into urban space. Can you please elaborate on the regional specifics of recycling, cultural recycling of Stalinist monuments? Thank you.
Thank you for your questions, Valentina. So yeah, I mean, essentially, I suppose my argument is that these monuments resist resignification, they resist reinterpretation. They're not just passive objects that can be reframed and recycled in whichever way possible. But there's actually boundaries or limits on the extent to which they could be reframed as part of an alternative political discourse. That they actually are because of their emotional resonance, which has in large part to do with the fact about how they were designed in the first place, but also because of the effects that they have in introducing amnesia over other aspects of the Stalinist experience, or even the history of their construction. The example that you use of destruction of older heritage that makes way for these objects is very relevant here. Because of these properties of Stalinist monuments, they actually do have a positive, an independent effect, shall we say, on memory of the Stalinist period. Or at least that's my working hypothesis. I'm not sure that I have proved it beyond a doubt in my paper, but at any rate, I think there's presumptive evidence to suggest that there is something going on here. With regards to the regional dimensions, I'm afraid I didn't look closely at this, but I think that even in cases where Stalinist architecture is not revalorized, where it is in fact viewed with hostility, it once again underscores the fact that there's limits to how much it can be recycled, that it's really difficult for Polish political discourse to reintegrate the Palace of Culture and Science into something new. And that's the reason why it's viewed with hostility, because it's still viewed as bearing some of the original symbolic import that it did at the time when it was constructed, as a demonstration of Stalinist state power, but also of Russian cultural domination. And so it's very difficult to erase those elements and to reframe it in a different direction. And that conditions both hostility and opposition to these objects, but also their revalorization in other settings across the post-Soviet space. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I think we must finish. It was a long, very long day, but very interesting. I would like to thank all the panelists once again, all the participants, and especially Valerie and Julia for your hospitality in St. Petersburg. Thank you, and see you tomorrow.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.